We play and call it work.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another painting video. I have another project to complete today. This time it is 3 Kroxigor, 3 fine cast Kroxigor for our Studio Seraphim army. However, we have existing Seraphim models already, Kroxigor to be exact, and I want to do my best to match the existing paint job, which is this right here. This model was painted at least 10 years ago. This model is an old metal guy. The paints used, I'm going to assume, were all Games Workshop, but I can't know for sure. And even if they were, the Citadel paints from that long ago would have been changed at least twice, I think, in their paint pigment and the name of the paint. So my attempt in today's video is to paint 3 Kroxigor to match this as close as possible, so that on camera, it looks like they're all painted at the same time by the same person. Now, to copy this miniature, I don't see a whole lot of challenges. This is painted quite a long time ago, so there's not a lot of airbrushing or blending techniques on this thing. I see a lot of dry brushing and a lot of washes, a lot of inks. The metal matching that, I'm not quite sure what that is yet, but I will figure that out when the time comes. And the scales, I have an idea already what that is. That's gonna be pretty easy, I think. However, I did notice that the basing is just plain sand, and I have already sanded and primed my Kroxigor miniatures. That means I have to now try to attempt to paint primed sand and make it look like unpainted sand. I think I can do it, but that is going to be the big challenge in today's miniature when I get to the basing part of the model. I always hate painting bases. And of course, because I'm still stuck at home, I do not have access to my airbrush, and I have to use the paints and paint brushes I already have stocked in my painting room right now. I primed the models with a Wraith Bone. I want to try to use contrast paints on these models if I can. If I can get the right mix to match the colors, this job is going to be incredibly easy. I first attempt Leviathan blue. It's too dark, so I wash it off. I try to mix greens with Griff Charger. I can't quite get the right mix, so I think I'm gonna have to abandon contrast paints and do this old school. My initial thoughts for the scales was a Lawthorn blue with a Gilliman glaze and then a white dry brush. I attempted that on a tail and realized that the hue was just off. I thought for sure this is what it was going to be. I had to wipe that off and reprime it with some Wraith Bone. After a few more attempts, I realized it was going to be Sotek green. And because I'm doing this old school painting style, I'm just gonna throw the paint on as fast as I can. I don't care about getting paint on other parts of the model. I have to go over every layer of this model, every patch of skin anyway, so I'm gonna throw it on everywhere and just overpaint it. While the Sotek green is drying, I'm gonna work on the weapons a little bit. It looks like the person who painted these previously painted them in a stone look, which I like. That's easy for me to do. I'm very familiar with painting stone, just some simple dry brushes. The first thing I have to do is cover the heavy parts of the weapon with an Abaddon black. And now that the Sotek green is all dry, we're gonna ink the model, we're gonna shade the model. I want to go with Gilliman glaze, but it seems to be a little hint of green in there. I don't know what the person would have used years ago, because I don't think anything existed in a shade or an ink that had that kind of hue. So I'm guessing here, I'm gonna mix, it's about a 2-to-1, it's roughly, I'm pouring it from the pot, 2-to-1 Gilliman glaze with Biltan green for my shade wash. And then I'm gonna slather it all over the scales. Once again, I don't care about over inking or over shading the model. I have to repaint all the parts of his flesh again later, so I can be very liberal and very fast in this stage. And once again, we are waiting for a layer to dry. So I'm gonna move back over to the weapon and start dry brushing them up. First thing I do is I put on some Esching Gray on a dry brush, clean it off on some paper towel as best as I can, and then wipe it all over the Abaddon black parts of the weapon. Once that dries, I do the same thing again with Dawnstone, and then Administratum Gray for the last highlight. Normally I would call this stone done, but I noticed that the previous model's stonework was a little lighter than mine. So I used Ulthuan Gray for a final dry brush highlight, and it matched perfectly. The next step was for me to dry brush the scales in Ceramite White, but when I was finishing up the stone weapons and using that Ulthuan Gray, I took a closer look at the scales and realized this is the same color paint that the person used to dry brush the scales. I actually thought it was Ceramite White. It had a tint of blue. It actually was an Ulthuan Gray, or an equivalent from many years ago. So I dry brush all the scales in the same Ulthuan Gray that the weapons got. Next it's time to work on the skin for the Kroxigor. I grabbed every one of my paints and couldn't match any one paint to the skin hue perfectly. The closest I thought was going to be Baneblade Brown, only a little bit darker. So I mixed some up with Abaddon Black in a shade that I think is going to be a little bit lighter than the final product of the previously finished model, because once I add a layer of Agrax Earthshade, it'll darken it up one layer more. So that's my goal here, to mix up a shade of skin color to be slightly lighter than is currently on the model. Now that I am happy with my mix, I'm going to cover up all the Kroxigor skin with this paint, taking care not to get any on the finished scales. I thought I mixed enough paint to cover all three of the Kroxigor. Unfortunately, I did not and had to mix more, but mixing on the palette right next to the previous color, you can match it up pretty easily. Now that the skin mix is all dry on the three miniatures, we're going to give the entire model's skin a layer of Agrax Earthshade. Being careful not to get any of this spilled onto the scales, but a little bit overlapping some of the scales on the edges of the face and around the shoulders isn't a terrible thing. A very light Baneblade Brown straight out of the pot dry brush will finish off the skin. Okay, it's time to work on the base. This is the part I was dreading. This is pure guesswork. I'm going to try to match that sand color as best as I possibly can. I know I'm going to use a shade, so I want to mix a paint color that's going to be lighter than the final product I want to use. And it seems to be Baneblade Brown is the theme of this miniature. So I'm going to use Baneblade Brown and Screaming Skull in a mix to make a nice little light color that I intend to put Agrax Earthshade over top in hopes that that makes the sandy color I'm going for here. So once that layer of paint is completely dry, I put on a layer of Agrax Earthshade and I'll let that completely dry. Don't second guess nothing and examine it. I looked at it, I think, it's a little off. I think it needs to be a little darker down low, but lighter up top. So what I do is I take some Nuln Oil and I mix it with a little bit of water. So 2 parts Nuln Oil to 1 part water and re-wash the bases. Once the Nuln Oil dries, it's starting to look right, just a bit too dark. So I go back to that Baneblade Brown and give the whole thing a dry brush. Once again, I'm looking at these bases and they're looking close, but not quite right. So I try one more dry brush with a Screaming Skull. I line up the miniatures and there it is. It's now looking pretty good. I take a step back and from a few feet away, if I couldn't see the static grass already glued onto the one base, I wouldn't have seen a difference. I think I did a pretty good job of matching unpainted sand. Moving on to the weapon hafts now, I'm pretty confident that the base coat is a flayed 1 flesh equivalent. So I give them all a 1 flayed 1 flesh covering. The spiny bone parts down the backs of the Kroxigor get the same Screaming Skull layer. One of the Kroxigors is exposing his tongue, so I'm gonna give him some Wazdaka red on that thing. And once that's all dry, the tongue, the spines along the back, and the weapon hafts all get an Agrax Earthshade wash. And like I said earlier, a lot of dry brushing on this model, so once all that Agrax Earthshade is dry, we're gonna put some flayed 1 flesh in a dry brush over top the weapon hafts. Only one of the 3 models has little extra embellishments. He's got 3 skulls hanging down from his neck and a weird leathery strap on his wrist going to his weapon. I'm gonna paint it with gray cere. And once that's completely dry, we're gonna put a layer of Skeleton Horde contrast paint over the skulls. And then we use the snakebite leather contrast paint to paint the straps on the necklace that is going into the skulls and on the leather strap around his wrist. All the toes and teeth have nothing fancy done to them, just a little bit of Pallid Witch flesh painted on. This model is getting nearly completed. We have to work on all the metal parts. I'm not quite sure what the jewelry and weapons were painted, what metal was used. I think the Liberator Gold can work as my base. So what I'm gonna do is paint one piece of jewelry on one of the Kroxigor's tail, fully with Liberator Gold. After giving it a moment to dry, I give it a layer of Agrax Earthshade, let that dry, and just look at that for a bit. I think I can work with that. That hue that I'm left with here is a good base for matching the previous guy's work. So now I'm going to cover the rest of the models, jewelry, and weapons with the same Liberator Gold. Once that's all nice and dry, I'm going to give the Agrax Earthshade wash. So now I need to worry about trying to figure out what that final highlight is. I got nothing in my paint rack that's going to match that. So I'm taking a guess here. I'm going to mix a layer of 2-to-1 Liberator Gold and Stormhost Silver. I've never done this before. I think it's gonna work. So I dry brush it on the first weapon, hold it up next to the previously painted model, and I'm thinking, wow, it's pretty close. So I'm gonna go with this. Just gotta dry brush it on the rest of the weapons and then do some swoops on some of the other parts of the metal, highlights here. Nothing fancy, nothing special, just hitting the highest points of the jewelry and the weapons. I glue on little static grass on these bases, line them up, and I'm thinking, I'm happy with this. I think I matched this model pretty good. So what do you think? Did I do a pretty good job of matching somebody else's paint scheme? Will you be able to tell the difference on camera? If you liked this video at all, I actually have another one up right now in the MiniWarGaming vault where I take a model I painted many years ago, back in the 90s, and just update the paint job. Bring it more in line with current standards or the current way I paint. That's in the MiniWarGaming vault, and if you're not already a vault member, you can click the link below. Get yourself a 7-day free trial, watch the video, watch everything else we have in the vault, and then you can just cancel if you want. You get a full refund, or you might just stick around because there's tons of extra videos in the vault. So did you find this video entertaining at all? Do you want to see more? Do you have any suggestions on things you want to see me attempt? Thanks for watching, everybody. Happy wargaming, and keep painting.